There are very few people as important to the pot trade as Dan McGinnis. This man not only was able to build one of the most successful plant empires, but he also practically shaped the pot trade into what it is today. So it's probably no wonder that he managed to evade capture for many years. However, as most of these tales go, his empire eventually came crashing down. And in today's video, we'll take a look at how he gained his way to the top and then lost that position. Please make sure to hit the like button, share this, subscribe, comment down below, and follow me on the social medias. The links are down below in the description. Welcome to this episode of the Trap Tree series. Anyways, this is LMC. Let's run it. Dan McGinnis, Irish Italian American, grew up in a regular working class neighborhood in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And for young Dan, teenage years into his young adulthood were spent in boarding and military schools in Connecticut. But in the 1960s, Dan decided to move out of his working class neighborhood and head west with a couple of his friends, arriving in San Francisco, where his relationship with selling the Zaza began. As you would expect, he started small, selling off small bags to the throngs of young people that were also making their way to San Francisco at the time. However, he wanted to make a lot of money, and selling small bags wasn't going to do that for him. So in 1966, he went back to Connecticut with plans to sell the bigger stuff. However, not too long after he made that move, he found himself in a deal that went south quickly. He had to defend himself in a gunfight, which ended with a couple of people passing away and Dan in jail. Now, Dan did not enjoy being locked up, so considering that he was facing charges of attempted assault and murder with a deadly weapon and fleeing the scene of a crime, his sentence was going to be a lot of years behind bars. So he and another inmate planned their escape, filing down the bars of their cell to make that possible. They succeeded and then made their way to California with new ideas on how to make money off of this plant. Now, Dan moved on to Connecticut, which was where he linked up with another dealer, Jim Hill, who would end up being his right-hand man in the business. Now, Dan and Jim figured that selling this plant would not make them the amount of money that they wanted, but smuggling was the way to go. And they figured that if they were going to smuggle, it didn't make much sense to do it small. The risk was about the same regardless of how small their load was. So their epiphany happened right on time too, because by 1967, the demand for pot had exploded. There was a demand and Dan and Jim just happened to be ready to meet it. Dan and Jim met up with a friend that introduced them to a local farmer outside of Tijuana, straight from the source. But they needed to move that supply to America, and the transport mode that they had landed on is mind-blowing. See, they learned from some of the other Tijuana smugglers to transport their goods by sea, but not in the usual way. So apparently, if you load up a tractor tire with the amount of flour that you want to transport, that tire would be buoyant enough to serve as a boat, and a human could swim inside as a propeller. Well, some of these smugglers, including Dan himself, were experienced swimmers, and even though transporting tires of pot proved to be a lot of work for even the most experienced swimmer, especially with the cold waters and lack of light, the thought of how much they could make was enough to convince them to continue to do it again and again. In fact, while things have changed and gotten more sophisticated with the smuggling, the tire transport thing is still some people's preferred mode of transport, surprisingly. Now, granted, law enforcement agencies are aware of this route now, some of them even calling it the pot wheels. But it seems like it's still considered a safe way to smuggle these things, at least safer than trying to go through legitimate transport routes. So at the time, though, Dan also considered pot wheels as a legitimate transport mode, but he thought that the original route that he was introduced was too difficult. There had to be a better way. Before we move on with the content, I want to say a big thank you to Dr. Smoke for supporting this content right here. So if you guys go to drsmoke.com, use my discount code LMC, you're going to get 15% off your entire order. And I highly recommend, you go to Dr. Smoke, order some stuff. They've got high quality stuff. They've got drinks. They've got all different types of goodies. Big brands, right? All different types of brands, 3Chi, all different types of stuff. They've got all different types of candy, right? All super high quality, all tested, all good to go, all legal, delivered to your door. So go to drsmoke.com, use discount code LMC at checkout, get 50% off your order. And also, this is gonna help, support this content here. So if you wanna support the show, go try it out. Go to drsmoke.com, use my discount code LMC, and get 50% off your order. Now, let's jump back into the content. So he and his friends set their sights on Arizona, a market that was largely untapped before he came on the scene. And they practically exploded the pot scene by making that move. Research has shown that between 1960 and 1970, there was a 3,000% increase in pot imports. And a lot of that is thanks to Dan and his friend. They were not only taking the road less traveled by selling pot in the locations where they didn't have regular supplies, They were also bringing a lot more of the plant than most people at the time. The way they got the loads past the Arizona border was also creative. So they moved their stuff from Tijuana to Arizona using the pot wheels, but to penetrate the state, they had to smuggle the stuff inside Bibles posing as missionaries. Dan and his friend wanted more, though. But where others would think of increasing the quantity of the plant they imported, Dan and his friends learned to fly single-engine planes. And by 1968, they had a crew that was flying large quantities of this plant into Arizona, allowing them to increase their imports. However, on one of those days when Dan, who was 23 at the time, was flying a plane with the supplies, he was shot down by the police and taken into custody. And Jim was caught a couple of days later as well, but he managed to post bail pretty quickly. Now, encouraged by that, Jim and Dan tried to hatch an escape plan together with some of their fellow smugglers that were also still in custody. See, unfortunately for him, that escape attempt proved unsuccessful, and Dan was eventually convicted. Now, there's no record on exactly how long he received, but according to Dan's memoir, he said, quote, "It was a bad sentence." After his sentencing, he was sent to the Sonoran State Prison, which was where Mexican authorities had started sending convicted smugglers. Sonoran State proved to be quite the fun place. People had visitors, and as often as they wanted. They threw parties, and there was acid plenty for whoever prisoner or warden. However, Dan still wanted out, and 2 years later, he managed to escape. The successful escape was due to the combination of Dan's willingness to be beaten within an inch of his life in order to be taken to an off-site hospital, and Jim's continued loyalty to his friend. See, unfortunately, because everyone now knew that he was a smuggler and a runaway prisoner at that, smuggling proved to be quite difficult. So he turned himself in and served another 2 years in prison. Now, it turned out that turning himself in was a good decision after all. While in prison, he took up a job cleaning pools in the upscale parts of the Fairfield, which was how he met a man called Van Wiedendaal, popularly known as Dutch. Dutch was undeniably wealthy, but he owned a chain of dry cleaning businesses. So according to Jim, there was absolutely no way that made all his money from dry cleaning. The businesses had to be a way to launder money. Turns out that he was right. But not only was he right, Dutch was actually willing to enter into a partnership with him. And this partnership led them to switching their supply source from Tijuana to Colombia. Now, Colombia wasn't any less safe, though. Law enforcement agents were also aware of Colombia being a supply spot for this plant, and the DEA was always flying that route, looking for smugglers like Dan and his crew that were trying to bring in the stuff through the air. However, like always, Dan found a smuggling route that was way safer: Panama. Panama shared a border with Colombia, so it was easy to move things through the country. But what really made the country safe for smuggling was the fact that some people in the government were heavily involved in smuggling as well. In fact, Dan was able to find his way into the good graces of Manuel Noriega, who at the time was the director of intelligence, but eventually became the president of Panama, and was also backed by the CIA. It's safe to say that Dan had a good time smuggling his goods into the US via Panama. Now, not only was he in good graces of people in the government, he also had something on them which double assured him that he wasn't going to be pursued. And like that, Dan McGinnis managed to build one of the biggest flower businesses of the 1970s. And that said, it's possible that you've never heard of him till today. And that's because he hasn't ever really been that popular in spite of his influence. From all of that being said, it is obvious that he heavily influenced the way these businesses are run nowadays, or these smuggling routes really. But he was never as big as the current families and cartels, largely because it was a really small operation in comparison, at the time, and as far as the manpower went, more so. And that's also how it always starts though too. This plant typically is the testing grounds for other harder drugs to come through, and it lays the blueprint down for the smuggling routes. Now, unfortunately for Dan though, one member of that already small staff decided to sing to the DEA. The guy, Kenny Knudsen, was Dan's pilot and frequently moved stuff for him from Colombia. On one of his trips, he was apprehended by the DEA, and he told them who he was working for without too much encouragement. However, even with that information that Dan was back into the smuggling business, he continued to evade capture for years. The man was slippery. In fact, he would later tell his daughter that he enjoyed the rush of tricking the feds and making a fool of the cops as he ran his business and escaped right under their noses. But then, in the late 1970s, Dan took a risk that didn't pay off. He accepted a contract from the Jamaican government to export Jamaican ganja. Things started off good enough and Dan was making a lot of money, but by the time 1978 rolled around, he was having mishap upon mishap that resulted in the loss of hundreds and hundreds of units of this plant. Dan started bleeding money, and when you lose money like that, you get desperate. Debts were piling up, and the Jamaicans were losing trust in him. And even Colombia was getting taken over by the crime families and the cartels. So when a new smuggler, Theo Polis, came into the scene with a deal for him, he was desperate enough to accept it without intensive intel on the situation. Unfortunately for him, Theo Polis was an undercover DEA agent, and the tricky Dan had finally been tricked himself. Dan was taken to court and convicted of various federal crimes, and while he awaited his sentence, Dan was held at the Tallahassee Detention Center. But a couple of months in, he decided that he had to escape again. So he broke one of his teeth and had to be taken to a dentist off-site because the detention center did not have an on-site dentist. While there, he managed to get the guards to leave him alone with the doctor, and then he picked his cuffs and made his escape. For 2 years, Dan lived as a relatively free man, but he continued to smuggle. It was on a relatively smaller scale though. So he had the time to play house with one of the loves of his life, and then one day in December of 1983, while he was having a meal at a diner, he was apprehended once again and sentenced to 60 years in prison. Now, after serving 25 years as a federal prisoner, he was released in 2003 to complete his sentence in a community correction center. He failed to show up at the center and remained on the run for about 1 year. In that period, he continued smuggling, of course. But he got caught again and incarcerated after a 24-hour manhunt sometime in 2004. And then in 2008, he was released for good. Now, none of the time spent behind bars did anything to discourage Dan from smuggling his plants. He would go to smuggle till the end of his life. But that end came in 2009, less than a year after he was finally released from prison. Anyways, people like Dan McGinnis are absolutely smuggling legends, and they just had it in their blood. Before we move on with the content, I want to say a big thank you to Dr. Smoke for supporting this content right here. So if you guys go to drsmoke.com, use my discount code LMC, you're gonna get 15% off your entire order. And I highly recommend, you go to Dr. Smoke, order some stuff. They've got high quality stuff. They've got drinks. They've got all different types of goodies, big brands, right? All different types of brands for your cheese, all different types of stuff. They've got all different types of candy, right? All super high quality, all tested, all good to go, all legal, delivered to your door. So go to drsmoke.com, use discount code LMC at checkout, get 50% off your order. And also, this is gonna help, support this content here. So if you want to support the show, go try it out. Go to drsmoke.com, use my discount code LMC, get 50% off your order. Now, let's jump back into the content. Big shouts out to Dan McGinnis. Anyways, if you like this episode of the Trap Tree series, please make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, follow me on all the socials, links down below the description. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Trap Tree series. Anyways, this is LMC, signing out. Yay!